this theme that recurs in the Bible about teaching, and you heard it in the reading from Ephesians, where the writer says, we must no longer be children, tossed about by every wind of doctrine, but we must rather grow up. And it's this theme about teaching that says, stop understanding these things. Once you understood these things in the way of children, but now you must understand them more maturely than you did before. You must understand them more completely. You must understand them like a grown person, not like a child, but like a grown person. The little sermon I did with the kids today about the bread, that was hard. That was more challenging. This is all more challenging than maybe some of you were ready for yet. Maybe. But that's what the Word of God does. It challenges us to grow a little bit beyond where we are now, or maybe a lot beyond, but a little bit at least for today. The challenge that's always in it says to us, you think you know these things. You think you understand. But maybe you don't. Maybe there's more that's needed. Maybe you need to get to the next level of understanding. Maybe you need to learn more. Maybe you need to think more. Maybe you need to pray more. Maybe you need to discuss more. Maybe. Because this stuff is really hard. I said to you last week that this bread of life discourse of Jesus, this is a bread of life summer, and we're going to learn about the bread of life, the fruit snacks of life, the bread of life for at least the next 5 or 6 weeks. I won't, I'm biting my tongue to jump ahead to the end of it, my favorite part. But suffice to say that this is challenging. It's a challenging part of the Bible. And over again, the theme is that the crowd or the people or the teachers or the disciples don't understand what Jesus is talking about. You see right in here that they're asking questions and he's saying something that isn't really an answer to their questions, and they're just getting more and more confused. I told you also last week that I'd be talking about the National Youth Gathering more and more, and so I will. I'll tell you another story of the National Youth Gathering. Last week, for those of you who weren't here, let me set the scene of what I showed on the screen last week. I showed where we worked at the playground. And we went and we worked. We pulled out stuff with our bare hands, right? Because the tools didn't show up. But now let me tell you that story again on a next level of understanding. Let me tell you it again, where it's not just sort of a childishly feel-good story of us sharing our gifts, sharing our abilities in that moment. You see, that day was a disaster for the youth gathering. Not for me, not for Chris, not for our group, but for the youth gathering, that day was a disaster. Nothing worked right that day. Everything that could go wrong went wrong. Nobody was in the place they were supposed to be at the time they were supposed to be in it. That included our group. We got there and we had no tools and we had no real instructions, and so we just jumped in and started doing stuff. And a little while later, an ELCA volunteer showed up and said to me, they're really not supposed to be doing like a lot of the things that they're doing. And I went, well, go tell them they're scattered across this whole huge space, and And there were a lot of reasons why the disaster happened. Chris can tell you that we stood in the launch space for 2 hours. We were supposed to launch at 8:45 a.m., and we actually launched at 10:40 a.m., 5 minutes before the second group was supposed to launch at 10:45 a.m. Do you know why that happened?
Because I get stuff ready. No.
Nobody told us why that was happening. Nobody told us why that was happening. And if you were following along online, which I know some of you were, and you said you were last week, the Youth Gathering Facebook page posted a thing that said fairly early on that said, there's been a terrible accident in Detroit. No one from the gathering was involved, but there was a terrible accident on the highway. and a whole bunch of the emergency first responders, all these people had to go and had to respond to it, and that's caused huge delays, and it caused us to not get to where we were supposed to go, because the police and the firefighters and the ambulance drivers and all the things that needed to be in place before we could go couldn't get in place because they were responding to this big accident that happened. And everybody went, oh, boy, that's tough. You know, and everybody in the gathering went, oh, that makes a lot of sense. That wasn't actually what happened. Or, to be fair to the ELCA, to the youth gathering, that wasn't all of what happened. That did happen, but that didn't cause the whole delay. That didn't cause the whole problem. That didn't cause that whole day to be a disaster. It was just an easy thing to point to, a thing that was more safe and comfortable to discuss as a reason for the delay. It was less challenging. Do you want to know what actually happened?
Yeah.
Of course you do. Of course you do. I'm going to get in trouble for this. What actually happened was a combination of that, but it was only a small factor. What actually happened was that some of the groups in Detroit that we were supposed to work with didn't show up. Some of the bus companies in Detroit that had been contracted to take these volunteers to their workspaces didn't show up. Some of the food companies that had been contracted to provide lunch for the kids who were working on these work sites didn't show up. Some of the volunteers who were supposed to manage the sites and bring water around to people and make sure that everything was going the way that it was supposed to go didn't show up. But that's not the challenging part. That's not the part that's difficult for me to say. Well, the next part isn't either. But that's not the part that's difficult to talk about. I can see why the ELCA didn't want to talk about it. Because they didn't want to talk about what would easily happen after that. If they said, oh, we're sorry, there's all these delays, because all of these people that we were relying on didn't show up. They knew what would happen after that. Because, see, the people who didn't show up were people from Detroit. Were companies from Detroit. Were people who had made promises and had signed papers and then didn't show up from Detroit. They didn't want what would happen after that. And you know, I can see, you know what would happen after that. Which is that so many people would go, oh, it figures. Like, isn't that typical? Isn't that typical of what happens, or what people in cities do, or what people in Detroit do? Isn't that typical of what these people do? Those people do. They knew that that would happen. And I knew when I said it this morning that that would happen. It may have even happened in here with some of you. That's the easy thing to say. The hard thing to think about is why. Why didn't those people show up? Why didn't they come? Why weren't they there when they promised to be? Do you know why? It's very easy. They didn't show up because they themselves are used to other people not showing up. They have over and over and over again experienced promises from politicians, from do-gooder groups, from people who have said, we're going to help you. We're going to fix this. We're going to work with you. We're going to save you. And then those people, those groups, those promises didn't show up. They didn't show up. And so to them, this is, to us from where we sit, to me from where I sit, I've been to so many of these events, and I'm like, how could you think the youth gathering wouldn't show up? Of course we're going to show up. We always show up. We're kind of annoying, but we show up. But to them, from where they sit, they've heard that before. They've heard the me, they've heard the do-gooder, they've heard the person from outside saying before, oh yeah, don't worry, help's on the way. It's coming, we're going to show up. And then it didn't happen. It went away. It sounded like a nice idea, but there was no follow-through. That's what happened. That's what happened in Detroit. Do you know how I know that? Because a young lady who was a volunteer for the ELCA came to us. She gathered us around after we had already done our work, after we pitched in and done the whole story I told you last week, where we tore the vines off the fences and we got, and then stuff did show up like equipment and things, and we did better and better, and we did so much work, and we were so proud of ourselves. But then our lunch didn't show up, and we were hungry and we were tired, and we gathered back together. And we made a plan. We figured it out. But before we left, she gathered us around, and she told us, you were standing there. Maybe it didn't sink in. She told us exactly what I just told you. She said, here's the thing you have to understand. Some people didn't show up this morning. But I don't blame them, she said, for not showing up. Because they didn't know that we were going to show up. In fact, they were pretty certain, based on their experience, based on over and over and over again in their lives and in the life of this community, people not showing up, promises not being kept, decisions not being followed through on. That's hard. That's so much harder than I want to wrestle with and think about. And it's certainly harder than a bunch of teenagers standing around going, where's our lunch? Should be, by all human standards, capable of wrestling with and thinking about. But she gathered us around and she told us that story. And some of them got it. Chris got it, more than he lets on to you. But she asked them, think about this. Not just what you experienced today. Not just the good feeling of feeding some people or tearing down some vines or doing a good day's work. Not just what you experienced today. Think about what's really going on. Think about what actually happened for these people who are so discouraged, who are so tired, who have had their hearts broken and their promises broken so many times. Think about what actually happened. Not to you, but to them. You showed up. You showed up. You kept the promise. You arrived on site. You did what you said you were going to do. I gave her a hug afterwards. I was like, I didn't think they got it, but that's so great. But it happened so that I can tell you about it. And so that they can go home and think about it and reflect on it. And so that all of us can know that the way that God works in the world is sometimes messy. Is most often messy. Is most often a mess like a whole bunch of weird foamy bread all around on the ground. And Moses turns to them and says, here, God has saved you. And they go, what the heck is it? It's the salvation of God. It might look like a mess. It might look like an intractable problem. It might look like something that makes us go, I want to feel good. And that doesn't really look that good. It's the salvation of God. It's the power of God coming into the world. You know, the people who come to Jesus, they say to him, essentially, they're like, what are you doing? Like, give us more of these signs. We heard that you did this miracle where you fed everyone. We want to see that again. What if he had given it to them? What if he had said, okay, all right, here, bring me some more loaves. All right, here's 5 more loaves. Boom! everyone's fed again. They would have gone home that night and gone to bed, and they would have gotten up the next day, and what would they have come looking for?
Food. Bread.
Another miracle, right? They would have come looking for another miracle. And Jesus said to them, look, that's not what's going on here. What you're looking for, you're looking to feel good today. You're looking to say, we experienced a miracle today. You're looking to say, to be able to tell your grandchildren, I was there when Jesus broke all those loaves and fed everybody. But that's not what's going on. What's really going on here is that the true bread from heaven has come into the world. Did you read that in the psalm? We all read it together. It says, he fed them with the bread of angels. And they're like, ooh, the bread of angels. Like that's probably made with stone ground whole wheat. That's probably the most delicious bread. Give us the bread of angels. The bread of angels, Jesus says, isn't something that was laying on the ground in the desert 1,000 years ago. The bread of angels isn't some magic miracle that gets bestowed on those who are lucky enough to be there. The bread of heaven. He says it's to believe in the one that God sent. And I said this over in Bible study this morning, I say that what that means is to live the life of Jesus. To adopt the heart of Jesus that loved fiercely, uncompromisingly, and to adopt the mind of Jesus. The mind of Jesus that says, what is really going on here? Why didn't they show up? Who is it that really needs us, and what is it that they really need? We're invited to grow up. No matter how young we are, no matter how old we are, we're invited to see, to experience, and to share the true bread from heaven. I'll give you a hint, it's not made with flour and yeast and water and brown sugar. It's made out of us. It's made of the life that we can share, of the love that we can have, and of the mind of Christ's compassion that we can connect with and participate in. So that we don't end up, when we hear things that are hard, sitting back like this and saying, that figures. That's typical. Those people. But that instead, we can sit down and gather around and listen and know that God is present even when everything is going on. May the peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and guard your minds. In Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen.